Bonjour à tous. Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the RPIC National Workshop Day 2 sessions. Just a reminder to use the Q&A. So during the session, if you think of questions you'd like to ask, use the Q&A function, and we'll make sure to present your questions to the panel at the end of their presentation. The session that is occurring now is the evolution of the federal real property policy and practice advice at TBS. This interactive session with the TBS Office of the Controller General will focus on implementing new and amended real property components of the policy and planning and management of investments, as well as the mandate and status of the new TBS Center of Expertise for Real Property. Our lead presenter today is Alistair Lowry, who is an executive director with TBS. Welcome, Alistair, and I'll leave you to present the rest of your team. Enjoy the session.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Luann. Bon après-midi à toutes et à tous, et merci pour être avec nous aujourd'hui. Pour commencer, j'aimerais reconnaître que puisque nous sommes à Ottawa, nous sommes sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé de la nation Algonquin-Anishinaabe. Je reconnais que l'on se trouve tous à des endroits différents et que par conséquent, vous êtes sur un autre territoire traditionnel autochtone. Je vous encourage à prendre un moment pour y penser. Je suis très contente d'être avec vous aujourd'hui afin d'avoir l'opportunité de partager des renseignements sur la politique et des conseils pratiques en matière de biens immobiliers et la création du Centre d'expertise pour les biens immobiliers qui vient d'être créé. Car il s'agit d'une innovation dont la portée est considérable pour la communauté immobilière. So, by way of introductions, as Luann mentioned, I'm Alistair Lowry, Executive Director of the newly formed Treasury Board Secretariat Real Property Center of Expertise. I'd like to introduce my co-presenters today from the Treasury Board of Canada's Secretariat. We have Mr. Naeem Gawi, who's the Director of Portfolio Management with the Real Property Center of Expertise. We have Mr. Todd Sandrock, who's the Director of Federal Real Property Policy in the Investment Management Directorate. That is also within the Acquired Services and Asset sector of TBS. And Ms. Stephanie Clavel, who manages the Real Property Enterprise Strategies Unit, also in the Investment Management Directorate with us at TBS. So we're all very pleased to be returning to RPIC today to give you an update on some of the activities happening at the Secretariat that affect the real property community.
Bon après-midi tout le monde et merci Alistair. Bon, j'aimerais commencer aujourd'hui en partageant avec vous un résumé des événements qui ont conduit au lancement de ces importantes initiatives au Secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor. Nous voilà en 2021 avec des éléments clés qui se sont parfaitement alignés. Rien n'aurait été possible sans l'examen horizontal des immobiliers dont l'annonce fut faite dans le budget fédéral de 2017 et qui a duré 3 ans. L'examen horizontal des immobiliers a été l'étude la plus complète du portefeuille immobilier fédéral en plus de 35 ans. En lançant l'examen, comme vous avez entendu, déjà aujourd'hui, le gouvernement a reconnu les valeurs des biens immobiliers en tant que facteur clé de l'exécution de ce programme. L'examen a révélé que le portefeuille des biens immobiliers fédéraux vieillit. Les coûts de l'entretien différé augmentent et l'état des biens se détériore et leur fonctionnalité est réduite. Un certain nombre de leurs facteurs interreliés, systématiques et complexes sont à l'origine de l'état actuel du portefeuille. 119 recommandations ont été présentées en février en décrivant comment le gouvernement peut transformer de façon significative la façon dont il entreprend les affaires immobilières. Et la réinitialisation de l'ensemble des politiques du Conseil de Trésor phase 2 est venue chapeauter ceci et commence par mettre les éléments nécessaires pour remédier ceci.
So the reviews team was led by ADM Diana Orange and included employees who worked previously in departments such as Public Services Procurement Canada, National Defence, Global Affairs Canada, and Fisheries and Oceans, among others. So Diane gave a great presentation at RPIC yesterday. Hopefully some of you were able to tune in for that session. And she chronicled the important work of the Fixed Asset Review in key areas of real property management. And they include areas like governance, portfolio management, funding sustainability, divestiture, and information management. I should also note that the review's recommendations also reflected on considerations related to the disruption to the workplace caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's a very important lens that was applied as the report was being finalized. So the work undertaken by the FAR team coincided with and also informed the work that was already underway at Treasury Board Secretariat to update its policy suite, including, most importantly, the new directive on the management of real property. So the new directive, approved by Treasury Board in May of this year, is really intended to encourage sustainable, financially responsible management of real property throughout its life cycle and in support of delivery of government programs. And importantly, it specifically emphasizes effective portfolio planning and the importance of real property portfolio strategies. So realizing the significant shifts in approaches to real property management called for by the fixed asset review and the new policy suite, it was decided as part of Budget 2021, which was announced in April 19th of this year, to establish the new Center of Expertise for Real Property at Treasury Board Secretariat. The new Real Property Center of Expertise will play a key role regarding the implementation of the fixed asset review recommendations and the TBS directive by providing support, direction, and advice to the custodial community in the areas of improved real property governance, portfolio management, funding sustainability, information management, and divestiture. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Todd and Stephanie, who are going to discuss some of the major changes brought about by the new policy suite and what this means for the real property community.
Thanks, Alistair. And I have to say, the irony of this is that I've stood in front of the RPIC community for the last number of years saying that we're late, and Alistair gets to be the person who says that we landed it. So, you know, I guess I'm happy. I'm very happy at that, to tell everyone that. So I'm just focusing on hexagon number 2 here about the community, the SDOs. So TBS is working with its community development office and you custodians to identify senior designated officials in real property. A reminder that SDOs are not new positions, but they have access to a custodian's deputy minister, technical capacity, competence, a mandate to advise DMs on corporate real estate processes, systems, controls, and tools, as well as the capacity of the deputy staff. The real property SDOs will populate a successor organization to TVSAC RP and provide advice to the real property deputies at an enterprise level. In terms of the next hexagon there, number 3, in terms of adjustments, you know, adjustments to these new instruments have been kind of a long game for us, and we had started this a while ago. Donc, nous avons essayé de vous préparer pour ces changements dans la mesure possible par le biais de nos discussions pendant les 7 dernières années, par les mouvements nuancés des questions de CHG, MAF, et grâce aux collègues comme ceci chez IBIC, here at RPIC, etc. I'll turn over to my colleague Stephanie at this point.
So Hexagon 4 speaks to the development of guidance by TBS in collaboration with the real property community. We're starting with a focus on 3 main areas that we've been receiving the most questions about and that reflect the most changes to the policy suite. Guidance will focus on the interpretation of policy requirements and best practices for implementation. We will go into more detail on these key areas of change and the development of guidance later in the presentation. Le bloc numéro 5 indique la fin de la période de transition qui aura lieu le 13 mai 2022. La période de transition a été mise en place pour donner du temps au ministère de s'adapter aux nouveaux instruments de politique. Pendant cette période, on travaille à l'élaboration des lignes directrices ainsi que fournir des interprétations provisoires de la politique pour répondre aux questions importantes des ministères gardiens. So you may ask, what happens on May 14, 2022, when the transition period is over? What happens if my department isn't compliant with the requirements of the new directive, like having a real property portfolio strategy developed? Well, given the scope of the work that needs to go into a portfolio strategy, we realize that every custodian may not have one in place by May 2022. This is a major change management initiative. For the real property portfolio strategy, we understand the complexity of the task and realize that there's a lot of upfront data and information collection that needs to go into it. Some custodians are farther down the line than others. It's an evolution of practice, and we understand this. The policy suite reset introduces changes to governance, process, and planning. Changes will take time, and the evolution of practice will continue past the end of the transition period. TDS is committed to working with custodians as they work towards being compliant with requirements. As a first step, it's important for custodians to become familiar with the policy and directive and to take steps to reflect new roles and responsibilities within their own internal governance structures and plan steps towards compliance. Understanding where program requirements are evolving is also a key factor in developing a real property portfolio strategy. Custodians are encouraged to engage their colleagues to have a clear understanding of their departments and the government's priorities and how real property can be positioned to enable achieving strategic objectives. The text in the arrow below at the bottom of the slide indicates that the Office of the Controller General and TBS will provide support to custodian departments during the transition period and on an ongoing basis. We're also working to update the Canada School of Public Service course, M721, Introduction to Real Property Management, to bring the content up to date. We have been and will be presenting on the policy suite reset and the new directive to departmental real property and policy groups. We also participate in forums like the National Executive Forum on Public Property and the Public Real Estate Network, where we can present to and have discussions with real property experts outside of the federal government. Je vais maintenant donner la parole à Todd qui décrira les 3 changements importants à la politique fédérale immobilière.
And I'll be really quick here. So our work to bring interpretation and guidance to new instruments, it's massive work and it's not complete, and it won't be complete for some months before you see a manual, a consolidated manual. Mais tout d'abord, nous sommes sur le point de publier un FAQ qui contient des questions primordiales, the most important things that as Stephanie has mentioned, that we should be looking at and providing advice on. So the focus on creating our first guidance and interpretation practices on 3 areas. Real property portfolio strategies. This is foundational to our work. This is an expression, a phrase you've heard many times during this RPIC session. Foundational to our work in corporate real estate going forward. Disposals. These are linked to probably half of the real property submissions that we see at TBS. And so this is a big chunk of what we do. And intertwined with that, there are new requirements and flexibilities in support of the interests of Indigenous peoples, because it's the right thing to do. I'll pass the next slide over.
Le tableau ici dans le diapo décrit les activités entreprises spécifiquement pour les biens immobiliers en vue de la mise en œuvre de l'initiative de réinitialisation de l'ensemble des politiques. Les activités ainsi que le mois cible associé et l'état actuel sont les suivants. La première activité est de fournir une interprétation provisoire de la politique en réponse aux demandes des gardiens. Cette activité est en cours et se poursuivra jusqu'à ce que les lignes directrices soient terminées. The second activity is engaging subject matter experts on the content of the frequently asked questions. This activity was completed in the summer during July and August. Next, we are going to publish the frequently asked questions on our GCpedia page. This is anticipated to take place this month. The document will be evergreen and we'll be adding questions and answers as we move forward. The link to our GCpedia page is in this presentation at the end, towards the end on the context page. La quatrième activité est le lancement de 2 groupes consultatifs pour l'élaboration de bulletins d'orientation. Un des groupes se concentrera sur les stratégies relatives au portefeuille de biens immobiliers et l'autre sur les dispositions et considérations autochtones. Le lancement de ces 2 groupes a été achevé en octobre. Moving on, so we have a set of recent community development and engagement activities. There was a learning event on Policy Suite Reset held by the Canada School of Public Service on October the 19th. A presentation on the Policy Suite Reset and Treasury Board Submission Challenge was made to the Real Property Policy Group, Working Group at Public Services and Procurement Canada on the 21st of October. This presentation that we're in now with the Real Property Institute of Canada. Finally, we're planning a meeting for the Real Property Senior Designated Official Council this month. The guidance bulletins will be finalized and published on GCpedia in December, and then published on canada.ca by May 2022. De janvier à décembre 2022, des bulletins d'orientation ultérieure seront élaborés et publiés. Et en 2023, le guide actualisé sur la gestion des biens immobiliers sera publié sur canada.ca. I'll turn it over to my colleagues in the Center of Expertise for the next slide.
Stéphanie. Et bon, voilà, le Centre d'expertise pour les biens immobiliers. Le budget de 2021 a alloué 5,2 millions sur 3 ans, à compter de 2021-22, afin de mettre en œuvre les recommandations issues de son examen des immobilisations, et là je cite, et d'aider les ministères à gérer les changements à l'utilisation des biens immobiliers causés par la pandémie de COVID-19. Cela permettra de s'assurer que le portefeuille des biens immobiliers du gouvernement est moderne, souple, rationalisé, tout en étant viable sur le plan environnemental et financier. C'est ce qui a permis la création récente du Centre d'expertise pour les biens immobiliers pour le gouvernement du Canada dans le but de soutenir la maturation de la gestion du portefeuille immobilier, y compris la coordination des principales recommandations découlant de l'examen horizontal des immobiliers. Le CEPBI en français ou COE, as we say in English, disposera d'un groupe allant jusqu'à 9 employés à temps plein, établi dans le secteur des services acquis et des actifs du Bureau du contrôleur général. Nous allons être une petite équipe, mais très agile, qui adoptera une approche de partenariat pratique en travaillant avec les ministères, en la différenciant de la fonction traditionnelle du secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor.
Great, thanks for that overview, Naeem. So the review itself recommended undertaking immediate, integrated, and systematic actions on multiple fronts to ensure a successful transition from our legacy portfolio and our traditional management practice to, a more managed, forward-looking strategic perspective. If you look on slide 8, you can see the figure here outlines 5 high-level challenge areas, or themes, if you like, which are the focus of the 119 fixed asset review recommendations. 58 of those were foundational recommendations, and there were also 61 best practice recommendations. And it really provides a path forward to start addressing the identified challenges. So of the FAR recommendations, the foundational ones at least, the Center of Expertise will focus initial efforts primarily in 2 areas, governance and portfolio management, recognizing that they also inform the other areas that I mentioned. So for example, effective long-term portfolio planning will assist in achieving funding sustainability by identifying resource gaps. So much of the interplay, there's a lot of interplay between the recommendation themes. And we'll see that as we discuss some more examples. So some of the examples of planned activities under the governance area include promoting evidence-based decision-making by establishing enterprise governance bodies. So developing an enterprise-wide framework on portfolio performance is going to be important, as well as sharing best practices on becoming a mature corporate real estate organization. Portfolio management itself is really the cornerstone for effective and efficient property planning and operations. So a strategic long-term approach to portfolio management is critical given its impact on program delivery, addressing the extended life cycle of real property, the cost to acquire, maintain, operate, and divest of real property assets, and the timeframes of about 4 to 7 years that it takes to plan and deliver major projects. So one of our priority activities under portfolio management also includes working with custodial departments to develop and implement changes to real property portfolio strategies. At the request of the Department of Finance, we will also be undertaking an important study on best value real estate solutions. including alternative ownership and financing arrangements. And we'll be conducting a comprehensive third-party review of the current service delivery model to assess its performance, identify best practices, and lessons learned. So this will be particularly interesting given that many departments currently follow a hybrid model with a mix of common service provider, in-house, and private sector approaches, each delivery approach with its own strengths and weaknesses. The Center of Expertise will also look at ways to address a challenge faced by virtually all custodians, that being funding sustainability for real property. And by sustainability, I mean that there's sufficient funding to operate, maintain an asset or a portfolio of assets throughout its life cycle in a way that its functionality and value are ensured. So from the point of acquisition through its operating phase to the point of disposal. This really involves making decisions that achieve the right balance between performance, expenditure, and risks. So as mentioned in the FAR presentation yesterday, implementation of good portfolio and asset management discipline is an important foundational step towards reaching a level of real property funding sustainability. Center of Expertise will also look at ways to improve and streamline the divestiture process, which I think will become a more pressing issue given the need to move to right-sized portfolios in response to changing program requirements and the need to rationalize our workplaces post-pandemic. We'll also work with the real property community on ways to improve real property information and information management, and the ways in which the information is used to support evidence-based investment decision-making. For example, how to improve quality and timeliness of real property condition and financial information, and ways to ensure comparability of data at the enterprise level. And this is particularly important in existing enterprise systems, such as the Directory of Federal Real Property, as an example, but also it's key as departments onboard new financial systems, such as SAP. And of course, as Roch Huppé mentioned in his opening remarks for the conference, we'll also look at opportunities to highlight how the government can leverage its substantial real property portfolio as a means to advance corporate priorities. So how can we lever the portfolio to advance objectives around greening, Indigenous reconciliation, accessibility, inclusiveness, heritage, and socioeconomic considerations, to name a few. So to wrap up this slide, I'd simply add that although objectives may have to be adjusted due to our limited budget and our limited time frame, the Center of Expertise will continue to work with stakeholders to support the implementation of fixed asset review recommendations over its 3-year mandate.
Alors, ce fut pratiquement 3 mois que l'équipe existe. Elle est constituée présentement d'Alistair, 2 analystes et moi-même. Et ce fut vraiment 3 mois très intéressants. L'un des plus grands défis qu'on a, c'est embaucher de nouveaux employés. Et aussi, bien sûr, on était dans une période d'élection. Mais quand même, on a mis en place certains éléments clés pour bien accélérer. À toi, Alistair.
So as I mentioned earlier, establishing sound enterprise governance for real property is a priority. So over the last few months, we've already established a Deputy Minister Committee as a subcommittee to PSMAC, and it's going to oversee implementation of key recommendations of the review. This newly established Deputy Minister Committee on Real Property, which held its first meeting on September 17th, will provide strategic advice on real property management from a whole of government perspective. It's co-chaired by TBS and PSPC, with the COE providing the secretariat function for the committee, and will also be responsible for reporting on the progress of the COE's work plan activities. As Todd mentioned earlier, TBS has recently taken steps to modernize its policies related to real property through Policy Suite Reset 1 and 2, which considers enhanced governance and oversight recommendations of the fixed asset review. So these policy updates established the new role, as Todd covered earlier, of the senior designated official for real property, and this is extremely important. It's a very senior level position supporting the deputy head and meeting real property policy objectives. So within this new context, we're currently looking at the Senior Designated Official Council on Real Property that will provide a forum to align real property best practices and modernized approaches to managing Government Canada's portfolio. So to summarize, delivering on the review's recommendations and implementing the directive has never been timelier than now, especially given the significant changes that the COVID-19 pandemic has unleashed in Canada and around the world. This actually gives us an important opportunity to rethink and recalibrate how we use our real property. Indeed, we want to continue to take advantage of the innovative practices that we were able to develop and implement throughout the pandemic. And many of those have been discussed over the past day and a half, which honestly, I think will ultimately accelerate us to be more agile and effective as a public service. So this also provides us with an opportunity to transform real property management and modernize, right-size, and green the real property portfolio moving forward. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Todd on the next steps specific to the policy, and also elaborate a little bit on the revised structure and contacts at TBS, as there have been a few changes in the org since the last RPIC workshop. And as we said in our session description, we'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers, which Todd has assured me has always been in short supply at past TBS.
Okay, thanks, Alistair. In terms of next steps on the policy side, I think Stephanie's gone through that in terms of our milestones and our shared work together. So all I can say is, this has really been our shared story, the story of the TBS, as well as the story of the TBS real property and practice function, which is enlarging and specializing. So my unit will continue to provide policy and practice advice and challenge on your memoranda to cabinet and your submissions. Stephanie's unit, under her new SD, Megan Baker, will complete guidance with your advice and participation, and she will continue to evolve real property practice and policy in the future, both of us working for our executive director, Sarah Evans. Alistair and Naeem's Center of Expertise will facilitate DM level real property governance. They'll move beyond the work of FAR, and they will evangelize portfolio strategies among federal custodians. So, and all of us under our Assistant Controller General, Sam Tattersall. So I say this every year, and I believe that at TBS and in our organization, we remain privileged. Nous sommes bien heureux et bien heureuses to work with and learn from you and this amazing federal corporate real estate community. So thank you so much from this point of view, and open our contact details are obviously there, but we can open it to questions.
Well, thank you very much to you all for that intense presentation. It was very quick, lots of information packed into a very comprehensive presentation. We didn't get a lot of questions, and some of the ones that were asked were kind of just looking for more information and how they can access more information. I just thought maybe you might want to expand a little bit on some of the points that you talked about in the key priorities. I was just looking back at some of the notes. Key priorities for focusing that the Center of Expertise is going to focus on in providing support to the departments as they try to implement the recommendations of the FAR. Anybody want to tackle?
Yeah, I can take that. So I think that if there's one thing you got out of the presentation today, it's that portfolio strategies are going to take a very prominent role moving forward. So as the fixed asset review recommendations made clear, in terms of portfolio management, there are some organizations out there that have sophisticated portfolio management practices in place, but a lot of departments really sort of need to up their game on portfolio management. And the key part of that is the portfolio strategy, which is supported by asset management frameworks and many other activities. So that's something we're going to be focusing on. As Stephanie mentioned, there's already working groups that have been established and started meeting to work with custodial departments on either developing a portfolio strategy or in a lot of cases enriching what they already have. And a lot of that information that's required will come from foundational activities that I also covered in terms of, where do you get your information? What kind of information management systems do you have available to you? And what kind of advanced planning are you doing in terms of the supply side of your portfolio strategy? So even though there are some really good examples out there, and having a working group of federal custodians is important in that we can share the best practices. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are folks out there doing a great job. And that group will be sort of giving a helping hand to other groups to help them come along. And also, I think it's about expanding on what's there, because there definitely are a lot of good portfolio strategies. So that's one area we're going to be taking a great focus on. I also mentioned some studies that were requested by the Department of Finance. So one is looking at current service delivery models. The other is looking at best value real estate solutions. So those will be taking an enterprise approach. And I have a feeling that a lot of the recommendations that come out of those studies will help inform people as they develop their portfolio strategies in terms of how to look at their service delivery model, how to assess its performance, how to assess whether any changes are needed. And then certainly on the best value real estate solutions, there'll be a lot of information there in terms of looking at alternative ownership and financing arrangements, which I think a lot of departments struggle with in their own silos. And I think taking an enterprise approach and looking at how different jurisdictions are handling ownership will also add value to portfolio strategies. So those are two areas that I know the COE will be primarily engaged in. And certainly, I'm sure Todd and Stephanie have other examples as well.
Is there any role for private sector in that? Does TBS see a role for them to play?
Yes, there will be, as there was with fixed asset review. Private sector will be engaged to provide advice on that, but also looking at models that are currently available in the private sector.
Okay, great. Will the guidance bulletins that are coming out in December provide like a roadmap, a checklist of what needs to be done by custodians in order to align with these new requirements?
Yes, so it'll essentially provide interpretation of the policy requirements pertaining to the different areas. So if it's a real property portfolio strategy, we'll look at all of the policy requirements, whether it be in the policy on the management and planning of investments or in the directive on the management of real property, and how those fold into the portfolio management process, and speak to how those can be implemented, focusing on best practices for the other areas of disposals and Indigenous considerations. Same type of thing. What requirements are touched on for those subject areas and how to implement them using best practices.
Thanks, Stephanie. Is there an ability to summarize kind of maybe the top 3 recommendations out of that FAR report that the committee is going to kind of focus on to start, or is it more generalized and more kind of a longer list?
So in terms of which committee are you referring to, Luann?
Well, just the FAR, just the 119 recommendations that came out of the fixed asset review. Were there, someone's just asking if you could summarize like the top recommendations, I guess. Well,
as I mentioned, portfolio management is top of mind. So obviously within that, it'll be the development of portfolio strategies. We're also looking to do work on the tail end of the life cycle, being divestiture management, and looking at how to streamline the divestiture process. So as I mentioned in my remarks, that's going to be a very important element moving forward as portfolios are right-sized, particularly as we look to return to work and what that may mean for the portfolio in terms of releasing space. So I think that's an area that's was already highlighted as a priority for fixed asset review, and that if you need to right-size your portfolio, you need to have a reasonable time frame to divest of assets that you no longer require. But I think that's been accelerated just given the pandemic and the return to work discussion. So I think that's another area that will come to the forefront. And as I mentioned, the enterprise data and data collection, information management systems, another area we're very interested in. Todd and Stephanie's group manages Directory of Federal Real Property. So there's a lot of areas there, I think, that we could look for improvement, and also looking at a combination of activities. So for instance, a registry for divestitures or surplus properties. And, can we incorporate that in existing systems, or do we need to look at some other kind of enterprise system to move that forward? So as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of these themes are interrelated. But those are some of the priority areas the COE will be engaging in over the coming months.
And just to pick up on that, I would say that, and as Alistair mentioned, the sort of concurrent evolution of the fixed asset review with the PSRR policy suite reset phase 2 was beneficial because, as Alistair said, informed by. So a lot of these themes are reflected in new requirements that have arisen: the primacy of portfolio strategies, the SDOs, and the raising of the level and stature of corporate real estate in the enterprise, information systems. Both new requirements pointed at deputies as well as practitioners. And the only other thing I'd like to say is, again, with that sort of gentle tick and talk of policy towards prescription and away towards streamlining. We've nudged it towards streamlining because there are many paths. Il y a beaucoup de cheminement for us to get to these destinations. So we're looking to the expertise of the community to help us get there.
Will your TBS team be providing additional guidance in terms of escalation rates that are used in analysis which informs project and portfolio planning?
That's that's certainly something that we have in mind. There's lots of thought around life cycle costing and what that means and how that will be done, working with our colleagues at Center for Greening Government as well to impute the shadow pricing for carbon into that analysis. So yes, we're thinking about tools that custodians can use to help them cost out their real property portfolio management over the life cycle. So yes, in a nutshell.
That's great news. How do you see the role of the core group of departments in the development and standardization of how to approach this portfolio management strategy?
So as I mentioned, different departments are in different places on the spectrum. There's some really good examples of great portfolio management practices, good portfolio management strategies. I can think of a few. Parks has a very good strategy. DFO is fairly mature. So as I mentioned, we're going to lever those groups that are further ahead and make sure that they're able to provide best practices, functional advice on how they've dealt with issues. As I mentioned, so a lot of them relate to improving the demand side of the portfolio strategies. And there's some leaders out there that can definitely provide processes and things they put in place to do that. I think there's a lot of departments that focus on the asset management side of things. That have lots of good examples in terms of how they've established regimes for building condition assessments, how they prioritize their assets to do that, and also how they've sought funding to make those activities happen. So again, it'll be a process of bringing people together, taking the leaders in the community in certain areas to talk about what they've done and sharing that with the rest of the community. And then the need is really to standardize our approaches. So as Stephanie mentioned, we'll be looking to come up with, building on the work of fixed asset review, templates and tools. And as Stephanie also mentioned, we'll be looking for input from other centers of expertise. So when it comes to the greening strategy, how does that fit in? The greening government strategy, how does that fit in with real property portfolio strategies? We'll be able to lever the experience within TBS, the Center for Greening Government, to help sort of flesh out those sections.
I think I'll jump in real quick to add to that, which is that we exist in Treasury Board Secretariat as part of a sector that also works on procurement, on project management, on investment planning, those sorts of things. And there is a great amount that we have to learn from our colleagues at TBS, but sort of as a technical and corporate function, how we fit in that all together as custodians. And so I think there's another kind of long game here too, which is, partly Alistair's scope and partly in Stephanie's scope in terms of how do we look at the maturity of organizations going forward, and how might we bring some more sophistication to that and a more modern look at organizational maturity.
Thank you for that. And just like tying into that, I guess one of the other questions was, will you be working together, TBS? I'm sure you've already done some preliminary thinking about accountability frameworks and evaluation of the departmental compliance and performance on these initiatives and achieving those goals.
Yes, Luann, we absolutely have. And I was looking at the chat comment, was the early thinking on it. And it has words like compliance, performance, accountability framework, very scary words, very much sticks. I think the approach we're looking
Pretty
for
canned.
is very much more trying to assess the maturity of organizations. So as I mentioned, organizations are on a spectrum of maturity, certainly within their, real property practices, portfolio practices, how they use performance information. So I think the approach we're going to be taking is much more sort of looking at the fixed asset review buckets in terms of life cycle management and how organizations, where they sit on the spectrum, where the gaps are and areas they need to improve. So I think that's the approach we're going to take. We'll see how the work goes, but certainly when you call it an accountability framework, it raises people's attention.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's a work in progress as it evolves, right? I mean, just looking at the timelines for the greening, I'm thinking like the greening was what, 2050? And is there a timeline on the implementation of all of the recommendations from the FAR, for example? I know when Diane was presenting, just questions to like, what are we looking at as realistic timelines now that we have all these recommendations? It's going to take a significant amount of time for departments to start to adapt and implement some of that and look at their portfolios. Is there sort of a projected plan of a timeline of accomplishing some of these recommendations?
So they vary. Obviously, some of the recommendations are a lot more complex than others.
Right.
We're developing a work plan right now, Luann. We're going through them. We're looking at sort of areas where I think within the next 6 months, we can make great progress. There's other activities that are sort of more medium term. And then when it comes to looking at things like studies on best value real estate solutions, looking at service delivery models, those are going to be coming towards the end of the 3-year period of our mandate. So that's part of the exercise we're going through right now, trying to triage 119 recommendations in 5 themes, sort of figuring out what's the art of the possible. Obviously, the funding provided in the budget for the COE and the mandate were not as substantial as the ask. So we're going through that sort of triage process now to see what we can tackle in the early days, and then what we can get started on in terms of studies and things of that nature that will bear fruit, I think, probably in the 2nd and 3rd year of the COE.
Yeah. I think real quick that part of this question, or the answer to this question, is that number one, we all know here, this is our work. Real property is generational. These are generational investments. So when we talk about tools, when we talk about processes and Alistair's work going forward, part of the answer is with you out there, is in terms of how these tools get adopted, how the investments get made, how the processes and the frameworks are improved and that sort of thing. So, we hold up a bit of a mirror and we look to obviously bring those tools and practices and listen to your best practices as well.
Well, that's a great way to wrap it up. I think that I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for that comprehensive and extensive presentation. There's a lot of work ahead for you guys in your new roles, tackling all of these issues and trying to find those synergies and working together with your colleagues at TBS and obviously all of us in the real property domain to start to do some of the implementation. So looking forward to hearing a lot more from you in the coming months and years. And thank you so very much for taking the time today to present to all of us here at RPIC 2021. We really appreciate your time and it was an excellent presentation. Looking forward to a wrap-up panel later on today. So welcoming you back in about a half an hour and we'll wrap up with the others in this stream. But thank you so much again. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.